Everyone, welcome to my channel. In today's video, I'm very excited to share with all of you a few new products to my collection. In particular, I wanted to do a comparison with you guys between the new Charlotte Tilbury matte liquid blushes and the new Danessa Myricks blurring balm blushes. If you're like me, you've been seeing these blushes all over social media for a long time. I wasn't sure if I was going to pick up either of them, but there were a lot of great deals recently, so I managed to score these during some discounts and special offers, and so here we are today. I have used both of these blushes quite a few times, and so today's not going to be a first impressions, but I wanted to actually put them side by side for you guys and talk through the similarities and differences in the formulas in case you're interested in picking up just one of them and want to see which one might be a better fit for you. Originally, this was just going to be a pretty short video just dealing with that comparison, but a few days ago I did go to the cosmetic company store and I picked up some goodies there, and so I'm really excited to try these out, and I figured why not do it on camera with you guys. So I have the Tom Ford Traceless Soft Matte Foundation in the shade 2 Buff, so I'll be trying this out for the first time today. And then also the Tom Ford Quad in Leopard Sun. So if you're interested in hearing about any of these products or just getting ready with me today, then just stick around. So in case you're just here for the blush content, I will have timestamps below in case you want to jump there. But let's start out with this Tom Ford foundation. So here is what the packaging looks like. Really pretty frosted plastic packaging. And then let's see, I think, do I just push this or twist this? Oh yes, okay, so you can twist it and the pump comes up. And let's just put some of this on the back of my hand. I really don't know if this is gonna work for me shade-wise. Okay, I think that's a little light, but hopefully will still work. Okay, so let's just start with maybe one pump and let's dot that around my face. Yeah, I think I probably would ideally be a couple shades deeper than this, but hopefully I can make this work. It's a very watery consistency, actually kind of surprising. I feel like most foundations in my collection nowadays are much thicker in consistency, but let's see how this applies. I'm usually not that much of a matte foundation fan, but since this is Tom Ford, I wanted to try it out. And for context, the cosmetic company store is a place that has sort of overstocked items from department stores, and so you can get really great deals on some luxury brands. In particular, the one near me has Tom Ford, Estee Lauder, Bobbi Brown, MAC, and Clinique. And so if you're interested in any of those brands, they definitely have a lot of those. And I picked this up because it was extremely discounted. It was like 75% off. For context, basically both this foundation and the palette normally retail for like $90 to $100, but I got each of these for only $25, which is for me an amazing bargain. And so I was really excited to pick these up. They're both pretty old products, but I do think Tom Ford products tend to stand the test of time. So let's see, this is what the foundation's looking like. So yes, definitely a bit light on me, but I think I can still pull it off. I think it matches my neck pretty well, actually. It's definitely giving a sort of soft matte finish like the name suggests. Right now it's not totally matte. I feel like I can still see a little bit moisture, but I think this is a foundation that I definitely would not powder. So I have pretty dry skin generally, and as I'm touching my face, there's a little bit of product that comes off, but on the whole, it is feeling pretty mattified. So let me just actually do one more pump for coverage. It's just interesting to me how liquidy this formula is. Again, I'm just not really used to this kind of texture. Pretty much all of my foundations have a thicker texture to them. I think because it's so liquidy on the plus side, it feels very lightweight on the skin. Basically, once the liquid evaporates, you're just left with a bit of that coverage on the skin. But at the same time, I think because it's so liquidy, it's definitely not very hydrating, so it doesn't have anything that's occlusive or thick or serum-y or lotion-like that might help preserve hydration on your skin. The other thing I'll note is this does have a lavender scent to it, which is the same scent that the Shade and Illuminate foundation has. So if you have that foundation, this one smells very similar. Personally, I like lavender, so it doesn't really bother me, but I did want to note that because I don't think any other brand, at least that I've tried, has this sort of lavender scent to their foundation products. But there we go. Okay, so I think that blended in really nicely, and at least upon initial application, looks really nice on the skin. I ended up using, I think, 3 to 4 pumps, and I think that's a little bit more than what I would do normally. I tried to build it up today just so we can really see what the coverage looks like, but I think for this kind of product, because it's a bit more matte, most days I would probably just go in with 1 or 2 pumps and then just rely on my concealer for more coverage. I think with 2 layers like I did today though, this is giving sort of a medium to medium high coverage. You can still definitely see some of my blemishes, so it's not full coverage by any means, but it still is quite perfecting. So I went off camera to do my brows, concealer, and primer. I also set my under eye area. As always, those products will be linked in the description box in case you guys are interested. I will say, as I was doing that, I was paying closer attention to the foundation, and it is looking a little bit dry on my skin. Not necessarily the most flattering close up. I think on camera it's looking pretty nice, / from a distance it's looking pretty nice, but when I look really close up, it's, yeah, not looking the best on my dry skin. But we'll have to see how it's performing at the end of this video. So now let's get into the blushes, the stars of today's video. So I did put a tiny bit of powder wherever I concealed my acne scarring, but other than that, my cheeks are still unset. So let's go in first with this Charlotte Tilbury blush. Just gonna, ooh, yikes, a lot just came out. All right, let's go in. Let's see, I think I'll go in on this side with the Charlotte. For context, I do have a good cheek and a bad cheek. This is my good cheek, this is my bad cheek. So there is a little bit of bias in this comparison, so do keep that in mind. So I'm going to start just with 2 dots. I find that's usually enough to give kind of a subtle flush. And let's blend this out. I'm using my BK Beauty 109 brush, which is my current favorite brush for liquid and cream blushes. And as you can see, this is making very quick work of blending it out. I do find that this formula is very blendable and looks really beautiful and natural when blended out this way. Wow, that's actually really nice. So that's where I would usually leave it, but because this is kind of the focus of today's video, I'm gonna go in just with 2 more dots just to make sure we can fully see that. And I will say the shade is a little bit fluorescent, and so it's definitely a very good spring shade, but if you're someone who wants more of a very natural blush shade, I wouldn't say this comes across as the most natural. If you use just 1 dot, maybe that will look just like a natural flush, but the finish of this blush is very natural. The color is a little bit more like spring and poppy. So here we go with the Charlotte on this side. So one thing I'll note about this formula is when you first apply it, it really does not look matte at all. You can actually probably see a little bit of sheen just from that kind of liquid finish that it gets. Over the course of the day though, it does kind of set down and become a bit more matte. So that's just something to note, because if you have dry skin like myself, you might find that over the course of the day, it does start looking a little bit drier. And if you do have dry patches, I think you want to be a little bit careful with this product. But at least on initial application, it's definitely very impeccable. So on the other side, let's go in with the Danessa Myricks. And I forgot to mention the shade names. So this one over here is Peach Pop, and this one is Rosé and Brunch. I'll also give you guys swatches in a bit. So this packaging just twists off like this, and I'm going to use that same brush. I cleaned it off a bit, and this one is quite pigmented, so I would say kind of be careful as you're picking it up, and then you can sort of zhuzh it out. I mean, you can see just how pigmented this formulation is. This shade is definitely a little bit more muted in comparison to Peach Pop. It's more pinky and a little bit cooler in tone. Just going to take a little bit more of that as well. And I thought these would be an interesting comparison because technically both of these are supposed to be sort of matte formulas, but they do actually perform quite differently. Okay, so there we go. Here is Rosé and Brunch blended out. So both of these are really, really beautifully blendable. As you could see with this same brush, they both look really lovely on the cheeks. Absolutely no patchiness whatsoever. And I would say upon initial application, they actually have a very similar finish as well. I think for this side, you can also see a little bit of that sheen just from the texture. Given that my foundation is more matte today, any sort of sheen that you're seeing on the cheeks is coming from the blush and not from the foundation. And let me also just give you guys a quick swatch. So here is the Peach Pop. Wow, I really squeezed out way too much. Okay. Yeah, that is one thing that's kind of finicky about this format. Once you squeeze any product out, you really can't get it back in. And so I have found it a little bit messy. Whereas I do like this format better. You can just get exactly as much product as you want, no waste whatsoever. I'll build that up a little bit more just so we can really see the difference. So here is how the formulas compare when initially applied. So you can see the Charlotte Tilbury looks really juicy and actually really high shine, even though it's supposed to be a matte blush. Whereas the Danessa Myricks has more of a satin finish. Definitely still a cream, but you can see that it's going to have more of a powdery dry down. I'll also show you guys how this looks at the end of today's video. In terms of the similarities and differences based on my previous experiences, I would say that the similarities are that both of these are very easy to blend, very easy to use blushes. So I've used both of them with fingers and with brushes, and in either case, I found them to be extremely blendable. They look really nice on bare skin, on skin tints, and on foundations. So in terms of performance, they're both really wonderful in that regard. Now, in terms of differences, I would say that the Charlotte, when you first apply it, looks more luminous than the Danessa Myricks. But when it's set down, the Charlotte definitely becomes much more matte, at least if you have dry skin like myself, whereas the Danessa Myricks maintains a little bit more of this kind of satin finish. Also, both of these, when you initially apply them, are quite pigmented. You could see that just with a couple dots on this side or just with a couple taps on this side, I was able to get pretty high pigmentation. The Charlotte does, however, tend to fade more, at least on my dry skin, in comparison to the Danessa Myricks. And I think that's just because as the Charlotte is drying down, the pigment maybe flakes off a little bit more, whereas the Danessa Myricks doesn't have as much of that issue. So that is one thing to note if you have dry skin. I think if you have more of a normal to oily skin type, you might not see much of a difference, like both sides might just stay really vibrant. But definitely on me, the Charlotte, as time goes, tends to look less vibrant. The other difference is, of course, price. So this guy over here is around $42, whereas this one is $25. And so I would say if you want to just pick up one of these, my personal recommendation would be to try the Danessa Myricks first because it's less expensive and I think it has a very similar effect but is a little bit more reliable in terms of longevity. That said, in terms of initial application, I think the Charlotte does look better. It does have a little bit more of that luminous, healthy, glow from within effect to it. So if you don't have dry skin, then this one might win out. But let's see how both of these fare at the end of today. So before we go to the eyes, I do want to also try this Danessa Myricks blush as a lip product because it's supposed to be multifunctional. So I'm going to just put this on my lips. I do have lip balm on already. Actually, let me take off that lip balm a bit just so, because I feel like it wasn't really sticking very well. So let's try that again. All right, there we go. I think that's better in terms of pigmentation. It's very pretty on the lips. Now, I don't really like matte lip formulas, so this is going to be interesting. I also don't really like 2-in-1 products usually. All right, so this definitely takes a little bit of blending. And if you do have any like lip balm product on, I do think that makes it a little bit harder for the product to stick on. but there we go. With a few layers and building up, I think we got good opacity. All right, so at least upon initial application, this is not feeling drying, which is great. It kind of feels like one of those more velvety, kind of moussey formulas for lipsticks. I imagine this is not going to feel hydrating at all over the course of the day. So really the question is going to be if it feels really drying or if it just kind of stays at the same level. I will say that it has a little bit of that kind of silicone taste and smell to it, which I'm not a huge fan of. Like, it kind of dissipates. I don't taste it anymore, but at least upon initial application, it definitely had that. Yeah, whenever I rub my lips together, I'm getting that kind of silicone flavor, which is not my favorite. So I would say, yeah, at least upon initial application, I'm not a huge fan of this as a lip product. I think in a pinch, or if I really wanted to do a purely monochromatic look, I would maybe put this on my lips, but I have so many lipsticks in my collection that on a general everyday basis, I can't imagine picking this over those. Also, I feel like because this is more so a blush, maybe you guys will be able to see this, but it's a little bit patchy in parts just because it's not totally opaque. And so I feel like there's parts of my lips where when I rub them together, the product wasn't totally evenly distributed. Not a huge deal in that I think if you're looking from any distance, you won't notice that patchiness. But for me, looking up close, I'm not really liking how that's looking. So now let's go into the eyes with this Tom Ford quad. I'm very excited to try out Leopard Sun. So here is the standard Tom Ford packaging. And here we have the lovely quad. So let me give you guys a nice close-up of this. This is a pretty warm color story, which I know is not really that popular nowadays, but I'm still excited to try this out. So to start this eye look, I have my Sonia G Worker, and I'm gonna first go into, let's see, how do I want to do today's look? Maybe I'll first go into this yellowy shade and just kind of sweep this generously on the inner 2/3. Ooh, actually, oh wow. So in pan, it doesn't really look that shimmery, but I feel like on the lids, it actually has some nice glisten to it. Can you guys see that? It's sort of a satin shimmer, but definitely a shimmer, whereas I was expecting a little bit more like a satin matte. Okay, that's nice. So basically I would say if you wanted a more muted look, you could use this kind of all over the lids as your shimmer shade. I mean, today I want to go in for sure with this shimmer shade, but this one's really pretty as well. Okay, nice. Bit unexpected. So turning that brush over, I'm going to go into this reddish shade now. Let's see what the finish looks like on this. And put this more in the outer portion. All right, this one also has that kind of subtle shimmer effect to it, which I think is quite nice. These sorts of slightly shimmery shades tend to be more flattering on texture and mature lids, and I think Tom Ford does tend to work well for those sorts of looks. Ooh, that's nice. Oh, that's pretty fun actually. You could do a really fun look just with these two shades. All right, but we are not stopping there. So now I'm going to go into the deepest shade and put this a little bit more on the tip of the brush and then trace this along the lash line. Okay, so this actually is not that deep, even though it's the one kind of more matte brown shade in this palette. Yeah, I would say actually the red might be a little bit deeper than this one. So in hindsight, probably doing it in this kind of layering fashion was not the best. I mean, I think you can still see that shade, but it's definitely not giving you the full effect. Interesting. Yeah, this palette's quite unique in that it has these three shades that I think all can be used for somewhat similar purposes in terms of transition or crease shade. All right, so now let's go in with a finger into this flaky shade. It looks really pretty. And I'm just going to put this throughout the center of the lid. Okay, so yeah, this is definitely giving more of a glitter topper effect. I probably should have put more of that yellowy shade underneath, but let's just try to build this up. It's definitely not an opaque shade, and so I am finding it to be a little bit sparse in areas. I'm having to kind of really dig my finger in order to get good pickup. But it is very pretty on the lids. I think in hindsight, I definitely should have covered up the center of the lid with one of the other shades and then gone in with this as a topper. Where I left it blank is looking a little bit sparse, but that's okay. We'll just keep building this up until we get some more opacity. Alrighty, there we go. Huh, that's really pretty actually. So very nice if you want a sort of warm gold reddish look. So I'm just going to amp things up a bit by first going back in with that brown shade in the outer portion. The one thing I'm not a huge fan of with this palette is I do feel like it kind of lacks depth. I really wish this deepest shade or this brown shade was a little bit deeper because I feel like it's not really giving that much in the outer portion. Like I'm having to go back into that red shade in order to add a little bit more dimension. And the red shade is also really a mid-tone shade. At this point, I've sort of covered up that initial yellow shade, but I did really like that. That was actually maybe my favorite shade in this palette, surprisingly. All right, for the lower lash line, I'm going in with my F06 brush from Chikuhodo. So I'm gonna first go into this shade and sweep this just all over that lower lash line area. It's kind of interesting. This shade technically has some golden shimmers in it. I'm not sure if the camera will pick it up, but it does have some little glistening particles in it. It's mostly coming across though as kind of satin matte on the skin. You're not really seeing much of that glimmer. Now I'm going to go into this shade and concentrate this kind of on the outer portion of the eye just to match the top. And then cleaning off that brush, I'm going into this yellowy shade and putting this on the inner 2/3. Alrighty, here we go. So here is the very simple and quick look using this Leopard Sun Quad. And I went off camera to do my eyeliner, so here is the final eye look. I kind of went very wonky with this eyeliner over here, so yeah, it's a little bit intense. But on the whole, I think this is a very nice, very easygoing eye look. I would say in terms of my overall initial impressions of this palette, I'm kind of surprised that my favorite shade was actually this yellow shade. It's to me the most unique in this palette. It has a little bit more oomph than I would have expected out of this sort of shade. It's very beautiful on the lids. This shade over here, which I thought would be kind of the star, is pretty, but definitely more of a glitter topper. It doesn't really give you a ton of payoff. If you are used to Pat McGrath eyeshadows and you like that more gilded look, I would say that this is going to take a lot of building up to give you that sort of effect. It's definitely more of a light shimmer glimmer on the lids. This red shade is pretty good. It's very nicely performing overall. Nothing really to write home about, but definitely a good shade. And then this shade over here was probably the one that disappointed me the most. It's just not that impactful. It doesn't really give you much depth. It doesn't give you that much payoff. I mean, I think in general you can see this quad is pretty soft in pigmentation. So not necessarily a problem if you like this sort of softer look. For me personally, I do like the option of going in with a bit more smoke, and so that is one thing I'm not a huge fan of with this. But on the whole, really good performing shadows and really easy to use. So here we are with the final look. What do you guys think? I did go in with a little bit of bronzer from my Scott Barnes palette. I put that on my nose and forehead and jawline. I kept it pretty minimal on the cheeks just because I really want us to be able to still see the blushes and not the contour. But on the whole, I think this look is pretty nice. I mean, I would say that I probably wouldn't pair this eyeshadow palette with these blushes and lip color in the future. It's a little bit It's a little bit more kind of fall, summer vibes on the eyes and very spring on the cheeks and lips. But other than that, I think the look is pretty nice. I would say that the foundation is looking good overall. It's looking actually less dry than it was upon initial application. I think a little bit of my oils have come through, so now it's actually looking a bit more natural. I think it was a good call for me not to powder most of my face, because for me this is definitely kind of a self-setting formula. I don't think I really need to mattify it anymore. So I wasn't a huge fan when I first applied it, but right now I'm actually feeling pretty good about it. It kind of looks the same as my foundations usually look when I put on a more luminous one but then set it, but this is just kind of like a one and done in that regard. In terms of the blushes, they're still both looking really amazing. I think you can also see that in the swatches as well. They're both very vibrant still. Maybe you can see a bit that the Charlotte has started to dry down and look a little bit more matte. It's still not fully dried yet, so it does take a little bit of time for this to totally set. On the cheeks, I think both sides are still looking really nice. Neither side is looking dry or patchy at all, which is great. Now my lips, on the other hand, are feeling very dry, so I definitely would not recommend wearing this as a lip product if you have really dry lips. I think it's not the worst matte lip that I've ever tried, but definitely not one that I would reach for again. So for me, this is definitely a cheek color and not a lip color. In terms of the eyeshadow palette, I think this is a really nice, very effortless look. Like I said, didn't really give me the depth or the shine that I typically go for, but I think in the future I would probably mainly go in with this palette for kind of a very simple, maybe one and done or two and done look. Probably mostly I'll be reaching for this yellowy shade and maybe just adding a bit more dimension with these two bottom shades. In terms of this shade over here, I'll use it in a pinch, but I think for the most part, if I wanted that effect, I would rather reach for one of my Pat McGrath palettes and then add a gold glitter topper that way. So I just wanted to come on because I actually just tried washing my arm, and you can see I've washed off all the eyeshadow. But one thing that was really interesting to me is that this Charlotte Tilbury one is kind of waterproof. Like, look at that. I actually tried moving it around, and I mean, some of it moves, but like it's kind of stuck on there. Whereas the Danessa Myricks definitely mostly came off. I mean, it's still also sticking a little bit, but the Charlotte one is really, I mean, I have to use a lot of force to get it to budge, and even at that, it's at most kind of smearing a bit. But yeah, just wanted to make note of that because, as I mentioned, like, I have had some issues in the past with longevity with this blush, but actually, at least on my arm, it's definitely staying put. And so I don't know, maybe if you put enough of a layer on this, it just kind of is budge proof. I don't know, jury's still out. I'll give you guys an update at the end of today in terms of how it's looking and wearing. But definitely if you put a really thick layer on like I did on my arm, this is really not moving, even if you try to wash it off. So here we are at the end of the day. It's been around 9 to 10 hours since I first put on this makeup. And I would say that on the whole, I'm actually really impressed with how this makeup wore over the course of the day. This is a lot of kind of new products, and so I really wasn't sure how I would feel about them. But on the whole, I think they held up really well. For context, I went on a really long walk today, I got dinner, I got drinks, and so this makeup has definitely been through quite a lot. Let me actually take you guys closer just to really get a good look at how the makeup is faring. So first off, in terms of the foundation, I'm actually pretty impressed. I did not really like how the foundation looked when I first put it on. It looked a little bit drying. It wasn't necessarily giving me the coverage that I was looking for. But I think after about an hour of application, it started looking really nice. I think that's when it kind of settled into my skin, and also a little bit of my oils came out. As you can see, at the end of the day, it's still looking really good. It's not looking greasy at all. There's definitely a little bit of breaking up here and there, like around my mouth, under the eyes, around my nose. That's pretty typical for me, so I wouldn't say this is like a mind-blowing foundation from that perspective, but it does look really nice. I think if you're like me and you have relatively dry skin, you really don't need to set this. Like you can see, I only put a tiny bit of powder around my under eye area and T-zone area, but it's looking really nice everywhere throughout the face. If anything, I kind of wish I didn't put that powder down, because the only places that are looking a little bit patchy or dry are the places where I applied powder. On the whole though, it does look very nice and perfecting on the skin. I wouldn't say this is kind of an everyday natural foundation. You do look like you have foundation on, especially from up close, and it can enhance some texture in dry areas. But on the whole, I was really impressed with just how perfecting it was. And I think the fact that you don't really need to powder it, at least if you have dry skin, is also a plus in terms of just taking out one of those steps. In terms of the eyeshadow, it's looking basically the same as when I first applied it, so that's great. I think it held up really well. There's really no problems whatsoever in terms of the quality of this Tom Ford eyeshadow. And I will say, even though I wasn't that blown away by the depth or the shine of the shadows when I first applied them, over the course of the day, I have really enjoyed how this is still really glam, even though it's a little bit more subtle than what I typically go for. I mean, the twinkle that the gold provides is actually really beautiful. It's not as in your face maybe as what I typically go for, but it's still very entrancing. So other than the lack of depth, I would say this palette is actually really nice if you want that kind of warm toned look. Now, in terms of the star of today's show, the blushes, I have to say they are looking really good. For the Charlotte side, this is probably the best wear test that I've had with it. As I mentioned earlier, I've had some kind of mixed experiences with this blush. I have had situations where it's kind of flaked off a bit or just faded as the day went on. But today, on my good cheek with this foundation, it is looking really nice. I really don't notice much fading, much wear, patchiness, any sort of issues. I think it looks more or less the same as how I applied it. Definitely less shine than when I first applied it, but also not dry, which is quite impressive. So it might be that if you apply this and you don't really use any powder, that really helps a lot. For context, in the past, I've either applied this kind of on bare skin or I've applied this on foundation that's more luminous and then gone in with my typical powder. So in those cases, I found the longevity was not as good, but today on a relatively matte foundation with no additional powder, it looks really nice. Now for the Danessa Myricks, I think this looks really lovely as well. I really do not see any change in this blush whatsoever since when I applied it. I also don't think it looks dry at all, which is really great. When I first was looking into this formula, I was a little bit worried that the sort of Upsolite technology was primarily catering to oily skin types, but at least in blush form, it looks great. And I really have nothing to fault this blush for. This blush has performed really well across all the different scenarios I've tried it with. So on bare skin, on skin tint, on foundation, set, unset, so on and so forth. So definitely can vouch for this. One thing I will note is even though I kind of think of these as two very different colors, honestly, I didn't really notice throughout the day that I have two quite different blush colors on. So I think on the skin, they're not actually as different as you might think. I mean, if you look closely, definitely this side is a bit more pink, a little bit more muted, a little bit more neutral, whereas this side has more peachiness, a little bit more pop. It has almost a slight fluorescence to it. But on the whole, I think they actually look decently similar once you blend them out. Now, in terms of the lips, that's where you see the most fading because I did just get back from dinner. And so you can tell that's basically all worn off. So I would say in terms of using this Danessa Myricks blush as a lip product, I don't really like it because, as I mentioned at the beginning, it sort of has that unpleasant silicone taste texture to it when you first apply it. I think the Upsolite does have a little bit of taste to it, which is, it doesn't linger at least, so that's fine, but you can definitely taste it when you first apply it. Also, it does that sort of thing that a lot of matte velvet lipsticks do, where it initially kind of shrink wraps your lips a little bit in terms of it dries them out a bit, and then it just kind of stays consistent. So I had that experience here as well. So initially it felt really dry and I felt like, oh my gosh, I need to put on some lip gloss right away. But then it kind of settled into a steady state where I didn't really feel it on the lips. Like, I could see that it had dried out my lips a little bit, like the lip lines were more prominent, but it didn't feel dry. So that was kind of a sweet spot. But because I did go out, I decided to put on lip gloss on top of it just to make sure that my lips would feel nourished, and that was really comfortable. I'll put up a picture here just so you can see what it looks like. So you definitely can, if you like the color and you want to make sort of a monochromatic look, basically put it on your lips and then put a thick lip gloss on top, and that will basically transform it into a more hydrating formula. So if you want to have that color, I think it's good used in that way. And I also think if you're used to matte lipsticks, you probably won't have a problem with this formula on the lips. For me personally though, I don't really anticipate using it on lips. I just don't really like multi-use products that much, and whereas there's some Danessa Myricks blushes, like specifically the ones she made, like the Do It Undercover blush that was in that acrylic packaging, that one I really like on the lips, but this one I definitely just like on the cheeks, and I'm not a huge fan of it on the lips. The last thing I'll mention is, as you guys saw, I had that swatch on my arm of the Charlotte blush, and that was really surprising to me because it was extremely hard to wash that off. I tried scrubbing it with soap for so long and it didn't come off until I applied some lotion, which is of course oil/wax based, and that helped remove it. So on the plus side, you can remove this with makeup remover, an oil-based makeup remover, but it was interesting to see that it really does not dissolve underwater or anything. So the upside of that is I think it can be quite long lasting. As I mentioned, I was kind of surprised about that because in my experience, I have noticed it sort of fading and flaking depending on what I have underneath. So that is one thing to note. I can see that she tried to make it very waterproof. So I think if you're in a very watery situation, like maybe a humid environment, maybe sweating, I think this blush will fare very well. But if you're quite oily, or if you have this blush interacting with some other products, then it might or might not stay on. The Danessa Myricks blush was pretty easy to wash off in either case, so that was one difference I noticed. So take that as you will. I will continue trying out both of these blushes and update you guys in terms of anything else that I glean. On the whole though, I think both of these are very nice blushes. I am very glad that I have both of these in my collection. As someone who typically does not like cream or liquid blushes, this is definitely a revelation for me that they can be quite nice. I still stand by my initial recommendation though, which is that if you want the more consistent blush that sort of works in every scenario, you don't really have to think about it, I think the Danessa Myricks is the way to go, especially because it's a lot more affordable. But if you're okay with finickiness and you mainly want the nicest finish, I do think the Charlotte looks a little bit nicer, but it's just you have to do more work and explore more variables to actually make sure it looks this nice and stays this nice. So that's the one thing there. This is a little bit more of a wild card, but you know, can be much nicer, whereas this one is just very solid, very consistent, delivers a really great finish every time. So that's it for today's video. I would love to hear in the comments what you guys think about these blushes. Is there one that you think looks better than the other? If you've tried them, please let me know your experiences, because especially when it comes to cream and liquid products, I feel like they can be quite polarizing, and it does matter a lot what your skin type is and your environment and all sorts of lifestyle factors. So I'm always interested in hearing how you guys have experienced these products. And if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel. Thank you all so much for joining me today, and I'll catch you next time. Bye!